Welcome, Joseph and Octavia, to Vägen mot Paradiset. I don't have an English name for it, so it's going to be Vägen mot Paradiset.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's been a while in the making. I've been in contact with you, Joseph. We tried to meet up before the summer, but then it didn't really work out with my schedule, I think it was. But so happy to have you both here now.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah,
Thanks for
really
the
happy
invite.
to be here. Thank you.
I got sort of I started learning about you from my friend Paul Svensson, who is my favorite chef, and he spoke very fondly of what you're doing at 59 Degrees Academy. And normally I hate to say, can you describe what you're doing? But this is an area that I find really, really interesting, but I feel still it's a bit new to me. So please describe what are you doing at the 59 Degrees Academy?
Well, the 59 Degrees Academy is essentially educating individuals, growers, businesses, students as to how we collectively can culture and foster a different way of interacting with plants, feeding ourselves. Essentially, I would say, to summarize, nurturing a culture of regenerative practice, as in not screwing the planet over.
Cool.
That's what we're about.
We're going to talk about soil health. Why is it important? We're going to connect it to human health, microbiome, both of the human gut and the soil microbiome. There are some really interesting connections there. I think we're also going to talk about why soil is often taken for granted, although it's something of the most precious that we have on this planet, that gives us food, nutritious food. It cleans the water, and it also can sequester carbon, so it can be a big part of the climate change that we're discussing every day. So for me, this is an area that's super interesting and quite new. So I'm going to ask maybe some stupid questions, but I think you'll have to bear with me and guide me through this journey. And Joseph, how do you start thinking about soil health, and what's your background?
Yeah.
Do you have parents that are farmers? Have you grown up on a farm, or what?
I had a bit of an interesting upbringing. So I come from, my mother's a bit of a hippie and my father's a real kind of autistic scientist. So I grew up on a dairy farm in West Wales, and very conventional, 600 milking cows, big business, lots of pollution, lots of fertilizer applications, and importantly, lots of very unhealthy human beings in the way that I would say it was a kind of extraction from the land in terms of not appreciating the value of land itself, but more so what can I reap from it, what can I take from it. And then my mother introduced me to a pretty famous man nowadays. His name's John Seymour. He was the man that initiated the self-sufficiency movement in the Western world. He's got many beautiful books. And so we'd have this kind of, I'd have this kind of really contrasting opinions growing up on this dairy farm and then being in the company of these really productive, really nutritious and kind of perhaps holistic way of working with soil and working with land. And that was the basis. That's my kind of foundation, if you like. And I took that into a career of arboriculture, and it was very soon into the work I was involved in. I recognized that I was dealing with the symptoms of ill plants, pruning dead wood, felling trees dying, and if I had customers that were asking me, what can I do to build health into their plants? And I said, well, you need to obviously work with the soil, but that's beyond my knowledge. And it got to a phase where I was just really tired of saying no. There was big investments being made by the customers, and the responsibility lay on me to find a solution. So I did a whole load of research, and it struck me that the research I was engaging in was potentially life-changing for a great many people. In fact, for everyone. This could revolutionize agriculture. And I feel like that the motivation for starting this company is that recycling and LED light bulbs weren't enough. It was like, this is not going to sort itself out. There's
You
no
need to
hero.
do more to, yeah.
There's no hero coming to the rescue. It's like we as individuals need to take absolute responsibility for this situation. And food health is in a critical state. Food health has been declining year after year as a result of us ignoring what it means to look after and nourish soil.
Yeah.
And I just feel that's worth standing by and worth investing my life into.
But I think what you guys are doing is so important, because to me, when I started looking at the area of, soil health, it's easy to get lost in all the different super small details. You start talking about like nematodes, arthropods, protozoa. That's super small bacteria and one cell organism living in the ground, and how they sort of interconnect with each other. This can sort of make it too difficult to understand if you dive into it too deep. That's what I did first, and I had to back out and see, like, okay, let's focus on the bigger picture. And what do you think, like, normally when you meet people, what would be the way to understand why should people care? What's the first thing that you use to talk to them about?
I guess at the end of the day, Joe always says that what you see above ground is like a product of what's going on below ground. So our health as a species is really reliant on the soil, and of course the planet as well, link in a lot of cycles that happen on Earth. And so it's really the thing that underpins ecosystems. It underpins health. And it's the thing that sort of unites all living creatures on the planet. So I guess it's the medium that is influences health overall.
Because you were talking, Joseph, before about the quality of food. So the last, I don't know how many years, but let's say the last 30, 50 years, the nutrition levels in vegetables, for example, has gone down quite dramatically.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on
Well,
that?
I think fundamentally, I'm a real nerd when it comes to use of language. And for me, health is a word that's often used. It's in the dictionary. The English dictionary is defined as a noun. Health is actually a verb, and it's a spiral. You're in a spiral of health or a spiral of disease. And therefore, we are actually doing health on a daily basis. Our health is influenced by the things that we are engaging with, the food we're putting in our mouth, the water we're drinking, the company we hold. It's influenced by a lot of things. And of course, the nutrient density of food has a huge impact on the way that cells regenerate and assimilate, and that then results in the health of the organism. My mother was a real fanatic about food, which she fed us, and I think my baseline of like good food was pretty high. Like all of the vitamins and minerals that a child would need in order to grow kind of strong and healthy. That was my baseline. And so now I go into the shops and I'm buying these vegetables. In fact, I don't buy them. That's the whole point of doing this. But I go into these stores and I just can't, the minerals and vitamins, and they just don't do it for me. They don't make me feel well. And so that kind of opens up the question as to basically what's going on with the food system. And the majority of us aren't, food is grown by your growers and shipped onto the free market and then bought essentially to the highest bidder. And but it's very much an industry, and that's to the detriment, because it's not food, there's no kind of engagement from the consumer in terms of seeing what's going on. We don't have any choice, and that's and I think that it's very important that everyone appreciates what's going on with plants, and the food that we're buying is actually what's going on with soil, and more importantly, what can be done to initiate and reestablish that spiral of health that we're talking about.
Because what we're seeing now as would be, I mean, classified as conventional farming, that's something that hasn't been done for many years. I mean, it's a recent phenomenon. And what you guys are talking about is regenerative farming, which is the way we have always been farming, where we bring back nutrients into the ground. We take out, but we also bring back. And now we just mostly take out, but then we put like fertilizers that we have manufactured ourselves and put it into the ground. And they are so much more narrow than the complexity of what the nature can provide.
Sure.
That would be my sort of...
Yeah, I think it's important to appreciate that we're not actually fertilizing. The way that we work, we're not actually, most often not. So the biology is the linchpin, if you will, between the nutrients that are locked in the minerals in the soil and the plant. So the biology, the soil biology, is essentially the digestive system of the plant, with the soil being the stomach, and that's what we're doing. So we're putting the biology there so that the plant can access the minerals it needs. There is nothing more than that knows what the plant needs than the plant itself. So instead of force feeding, which could be the equivalent of an IV drip, we're actually allowing the plant to take complete control of the take-up of minerals, and therefore express itself genetically, as it will. And I think it's important to note that how is it possible for us human beings to express our true and remarkable genetic potential when plants can't do the same? We simply can't. And the current model looks like, instead of building health, it looks like suppressing disease. So soybeans, for example, are genetically modified to withstand glyphosate or Roundup so that they can spray the hell out of them. And then we're feeding. The majority of vegans would be feeding off of or eating off of that. I mean, that can't sustain the human body. And there is so much illness and chronic disease. I read recently that 40% of American children are chronically ill. And
you stop for a while. You're jumping ahead, but yes, we're going to get there. And this is obviously a follow-up effect. But if I'm trying to understand this correctly again, so in the modern conventional farming structure, I'm asking Octavia now. So if you would put fertilizers, you have something called the big three, which is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. In Swedish, that would be kväve, fosfor, kalium, so NPK.
Yeah, NPK.
Yeah. And if I would turn that into me being a person, if that's saying like, okay, so if I would get only 3 things that I could eat, and this would have to build my body and make it strong and healthy, it's obviously going to be quite difficult. It's a very rough generalization, but I'm missing out on quite a lot of other nutrients that I would need to create a good health.
Absolutely, yeah. So I believe it's about 84 different sort of macro and micro nutrients that you need for metabolism. So if you're applying NPK to the land, that's I mean nitrogen, for instance, is one of the sort of the primary nutrients that a plant needs in order to grow. And so what happens is you see leafy growth, you see a lot of growth in the plant, and it can be quite deceptive because these, your vegetables or crops or whatever, the yield is there or the productivity might be there, but at the core of it, to start with, that plant hasn't been able to obtain the right sort of balance, the full spectrum that it needs of nutrients, and so it can be quite devoid of nutrients. And then on top of that, adding NPK to the soil environment also then creates this fairly hostile environment, and all of the microbes and sort of microorganisms within the soil, they're fragile organisms, and they don't function optimally when you apply those fertilizers in excess year after year.
Could I make the assumption, going back to Joseph, where I mean the thing you were talking about, like if you look at the American population, for example, where they eat what's called ultra-processed foods, like 65% of all calories are ultra-processed foods, which then results in an obesity epidemic. where they are suffering from malnutrition. So if you took that to a plant, you give them a lot of ultra-processed food and NPK basically, and not enough nutrients. They would grow really fast, but they would be energy deficient, malnutrition.
Malnourished.
Malnourished, thank you.
Exactly.
Could that be a sort of a comparison?
I like to say that you could feed a child pizza and candy and that child will grow, but it's not going to be an optimal expression of itself. And the same can be exactly said for plants. What I believe we need to do is ensure that plants are have access to the minerals they need at exactly the right time, and therefore we can ensure that the plant can carry the benefits of that health through into the human realm, so to say. And that obviously isn't happening at the moment.
Because another problem, sorry, I'll let you talk soon, but another problem is also that what we're doing with the monocultures, that we're only having one crop that is growing, is that we're also adding pesticides and herbicides, all the kind of poison to kill off everything else that we don't want growing there. And then we feed the ground with the fertilizers that we have made in a factory. And this obviously, for the soil, it must be quite terrible to first of all get shocked with some fertilizers, then you get some poison, all the animals living inside, the worms and the bacteria and the whatever, the nematodes and the arthropods and all that dies.
Yeah, the problem with any monoculture is without sort of diversity, it's very susceptible to pests and disease. The more diversity you can encourage, whether it be in a crop or in your microbe sort of community within the soil, the more diversity you have, the more resistant it is then to pests and disease. So like Joe was saying, with this kind of upward spiral of health, you increase the diversity there, and you're increasing its resistance to all these pests and disease. But then the other way around, if you've got a monoculture, then you've not got that diversity there feeding the microbial communities, and then sort of they become a monoculture in themselves, just adapted for that one specific crop. And then, of course, you need to spray more and more because you're creating this downward spiral of health.
And what happens to the topsoil then is that it becomes very, it basically dies. It goes from soil to dirt. So when it rains, it washes away.
Yeah.
So you have the topsoil erosion, I think the term is, where everything goes into the rivers and into the oceans, basically.
So ploughing the soil, for instance, you're kind of setting that soil back to day zero, as it were, on like an evolutionary scale. So the microbe communities within that soil become quite basic. And those microbes are really important for actually holding the soil together. So like a fungal hyphae, for instance, they literally sort of bind the soil together in these like aggregated particles. And it means if you don't have them then in the soil, it can become very susceptible to leaching.
But to me, when I'm driving through the Swedish countryside and I see this farmer going with his tractor and he has this plow turning the topsoil, should he not be doing that at all? Or because that's, I mean, it has been everywhere in what I've been seeing when I've been growing up and going to my country place or whatever.
Well, I think it's important to look at what we want from these systems. And for me, a productive system is a healthy system, or a healthy system is a productive system. And to yield the most out of a piece of land, we have to acknowledge the kind of key facets, if you like, of what influences yield. And plants, of course, they need access to minerals in order to produce their own food. They're what we call photoautotrophs, so they produce their own food from carbon dioxide. They need access to water, but in order to produce their own food, rather, they need the minerals from the soil, and they need water. And these are all influenced by the microbial communities, which essentially means that we need a really good soil structure. And when we go and till soil, we
till that's turning
when
around,
we turn,
right?
When we turn soil, we destroy that soil structure and we engineer it into something very different. And as Octavia alluded to a second ago, the communities of organisms which want to become more and more complex and more diverse, they die, and you're bringing that soil back to a very early state which can't support the plants that we need. It doesn't really have the release of minerals.
But why would you then do it? Because is it an aesthetic function, or why do you till the soil?
So, to start with, when ploughing the soil, you have like a mass sort of death, basically, of a lot of organisms within the soil, and because of that releases a lot of minerals and nutrients into the soil. So, for the first couple of years, you'll see sort of increased crop growth, because
so it's a short-term efficient, but long-term it's negative.
Yeah. Sure. And I think the places that we look at, say the Middle East, for example, Iraq, Iran, and these places, these were talked about in terms of areas of milk and honey in biblical terms. These were hugely productive, but equally they were implementing use of the plough at very early stages. And I think what we fail to recognize is that soil ultimately is created by the microbiology. Soil is an ecosystem, and that's something that is simply not taught about in modern tertiary education, as you will. And so I think the reason ploughing or tilling occurs is because of our lack of understanding, you could call it ignorance. You know, I go onto a modern farm these days and all I see are these weapons of mass destruction. My kids used to ask when I first started researching about this, we'd drive past the tractors ploughing, I'd see all of this topsoil dust flying off, and they'd say, is he killing his microorganisms, Papa?
How old are your kids?
My kids were, I think, 6 and 8 at the time.
Yeah.
And
so basically, if I see a farmer going around tilling or turning over the soil, I should tell him to stop. I mean, obviously, I should be very careful coming from Stockholm and saying that. But basically, what he's doing, he or she doesn't really know that this is long-term going to be very negative for the soil health.
Sure. I think we saw last year, like we had, I think, was it 4 or 5 months without any rain at all? And importantly, what disturbing soil does, so if I'm just to cover the science behind it quickly, the bacteria, they produce glues that bind, they glue themselves to the minerals of the soil. And that in itself creates these, what we call micro aggregates. And then the fungi, they bind these micro aggregates into bigger aggregates called macro aggregates. And that's where your soil structure comes. And so what happens is that, and importantly, again, the fungi, they have these suppressive enzymes that keep the numbers of bacteria down, because bacteria aren't necessarily, too much bacteria in the soil aren't necessarily a good thing for reasons beyond that we're going to go into now. Yep. But if you wipe out the fungi, then you get an explosion of numbers of bacteria. Then they'll start to eat the soil carbon, and that oxidizes. And this is really relevant in terms of water holding capacity. So every 1% your soil carbon goes up, your soil is able to hold something in the region of 35 or 40,000 liters of water per hectare.
But this is important because you're saying the soil carbon.
Soil carbon.
So, and the whole solution, or the whole problem we're discussing with having too much carbon dioxide in the sky, if I'm using my words, we want to bind it, we want to sequester it into the ground. And by tilling, we're releasing it. So just so I sort of sum up soil, so I understand.
Yeah, soil is like, it's a massive source of carbon, which can either be released or more carbon can be stored within it. Soil across the globe stores 2,500 gigatons of carbon, which is more than the atmosphere and all life on Earth. So it's like this mega store of carbon. And you can either work with the soil and sort of work with it sustainably and sequester carbon within the body of soil, or if you're tilling or ploughing, then carbon can be released into the atmosphere.
Because what I think is so important or so interesting is that you normally talk about like forests, like the Amazon, for example, which has been my focus area for a long time now, where you know that, okay, so the trees, they sequester or they bind carbon, and when they burn, you release it into the sky, okay? But nobody talks about the soil. Not many people, at least. And if I understand this correctly, because a tree can take many, many, many years to grow, and the bigger it gets, the more carbon it can hold, right?
Well,
But-
not
No?
true.
Yeah.
Yes, but we're not actually looking at the trees as storing carbon. They do, but the majority of carbon is held in the soil. And so what trees do is they are huge. They have the huge capacity to take and sequester carbon, take it out of the atmosphere, and hold it in the soil. And it's predominantly the fungi there and the mycorrhizae and these organisms that are holding the soil carbon.
But just so I understand, because the photosynthesis, that you have sunlight and you have water and you have carbon dioxide, and this I thought happened sort of above ground with the plants and the trees, and they then convert the sunlight, the water, and the carbon dioxide into glucose and oxygen. And the glucose goes down into the ground and where it sort of feeds the soil and other organisms. And the oxygen goes out so we can breathe. So if we then have a big tree with tens of thousands of leaves, I would imagine that would be an efficient sort of photosynthesis carbon dioxide converter. But that's just my sort of basic understanding. Would there be any sense in that, or do I misunderstand?
Yeah, there is sense in that. I mean, I guess the other thing is, say, for example, leaves, that they'll, particularly with a deciduous tree, will sort of fall
What's
onto
that?
like a tree that sheds its leaves on an annual
okay.
sort of
Yeah, yeah.
cycle. Yeah. So when it sheds its leaves onto the ground, that then becomes, or that is organic matter, and that can then be utilized by the microorganisms that live
And
there.
turned into soil.
Exactly, yeah, and carbon's actually released in that process, so that is released back up into the atmosphere, or sort of captured by the canopy sometimes, but also. At the end of that decomposition process, you have these really complex molecules that sort of bind together to form this compound called humus. And humus is like really rich in carbon and can last for sort of centuries within the soil. So that's
And humus is not hummus that we can eat.
Yeah.
It's something completely different, right?
very different.
Yeah.
Not edible, I don't
No.
think, anyway.
Good.
And it's this sort of, basically it's like a sponge of carbon and water and nutrients. It's a really incredible sort of structure within the soil.
And this is essentially what's so lacking in the soil systems of farming, modern day, so we call conventional farms now, because of the tilling and the turning, ploughing process.
But so the driving force of the now sort of conventional way of handling things, I would assume, would be the seed companies or whatever, that like the BASF, I guess the Bayer or the ex Monsanto, selling both the GMO seeds and wanting you to use only their product. And they would tell you this is the way to do it, because then you're going to earn more money, you're going to get bigger yields, more output if you do it the way we say. But the research that I've read says that this doesn't really happen. Instead, the efficiency is lower on a longer term. But then you're so caught up in the structure and you've learned how to do it, and you always have a good marketing answer from the industry to tell you why you're actually might be doing it wrong right now. And if you change just a little bit and use our next product, then it's going to be better. So how can we change? How do you work to change the minds? And get people to understand that they can earn more money, hopefully, by using regenerative agriculture, because that everything comes down to money if you're
Sure.
a businessman or
Sure.
a farmer.
Well, I think that my understanding of human culture, if you will, is that people don't change because they want to, they change because they have to.
Yeah.
Their habits are no longer serving them the way that they needed to. And I guess that in a kind of micro scale is evolution. You know, inherently you could question it, but we are very intelligent human beings, and there is a very strong will to survive. And I think that in this instance looks like adapting farming practices to a more resilient and robust way of working. And clearly we see, as last year, you know, where our farming in this region or in any region is entirely dependent on the hydrological cycles, you know, as in raining, that's a fundamental dependency on the systems. And if we're, you know, if it doesn't rain for a certain period of time, then our crops are dying and our animals don't have anything to eat. We saw that, you know, the slaughterhouses back in the summer of last year were just full of animals because the farmers didn't have anything to feed them. So I would say
this is something, I'm sorry, but because that's another area then that it's super interesting, because if you have healthy soil where a lot of plants are growing, it will bind more water.
Sure.
Right?
So the greater the carbon in your soil, the more water it holds. That's fundamental. And the healthier the soil, the richer, the better the structure, which means the roots are going to penetrate deeper, which means the more water available to it. So our way of working is to ensure that the structure is as the plant would want it, so that roots can penetrate really deep and build a really big root biomass, we call it. And then you have a more resilient and robust plant which can harvest the nutrients it needs. Your grass, if that's what you're growing, is richer in the proteins that the animal would need. So we can see that clearly the endeavor of farming is to grow soil, and the plant will grow itself.
That's a really cool saying. The endeavor of farming is to grow soil.
Yeah.
And that's a huge shift from talking about the end product, which is the corn or the
well, plants
whatever.
can grow themselves.
Yeah. No, that's and I love it. I watched. I got a tip from you before the summer. I think it was a British guy called Alan Savory about desertification, and that's another area I didn't have a clue about how it works. And I thought that was so interesting because he was talking in a TED talk. I recommend everybody to look at it. I'll see if I can send it into the show notes as well, where they actually use livestock like cows pushed together in a much 400% higher concentration than you would have if they would normally be on an area, and then pushed through an area where it was previously almost dead, and their manure or like dung or whatever you call it in English, and they trampling down the existing plants made everything start growing again.
Yeah, I think Joe might be able to answer this better than me, but you know, it's all about kind of closing the cycle or closing the gap within these cycles. And, you know, it's taken however many billion years to get to this point in history, you know, where we are now. And animals have very much been a part of that. Livestock or big herds of animals have been a part of that. And they are in ecosystems fundamental to closing the loop. And form or perform quite a big sort of role within the ecosystem, as the microorganisms do.
So basically, it all comes back to, as in most things that I see within health, if it's our own health or planet health, it's about, letting nature do its job, because it has been evolving for so many millions of years, like you say, and it knows what it's doing. And here comes the little human being and tries to take control of everything and fucks everything up, basically, in my words.
Yeah.
And we should just step aside and watch nature and try to mimic nature.
Yeah, biomimicry, exactly. That's essentially the foundation of the work that we're doing. The thought coming to my mind when Octavia was speaking earlier is that animals, they're ungulates, we call them, grazing animals, animals that digest grass. Everything from the way that to the kind of physiology of the mouth, anatomy of the mouth, to the anatomy of the hoof. So when grass has been sheared off or torn off by the jaw action of the animal, there is something called this exudate flush. The plant recognizes that, okay, well, I've had my I've had my food material taken off, so I need to regenerate. So it shoots out these carbohydrates, lipids, amino acids into the soil, which creates this flurry of activity that then releases an abundance of minerals that then the plant has to regenerate itself. And so clearly in that example, we can see this wonderful symbiosis. Plants have developed very clever strategies for luring animals to their gain. Everything from the scent of a flower to the taste of a really good plum or whatever, it's very, very, there's this remarkable intelligence behind it. And I think we come in with our big destructive combustion engine just blitzing it. And the modern farming practice can be likened to the exploitative practices of mining, for instance. We don't see soil as this matrix of material that can actually nourish us. We see it as something that can be exploited. And in nature,
if I would make a really horrible, and I'm sorry if I offend anybody, but basically I would say this is like we're not making love to the earth or to the soil. We're raping it constantly. And
Farmageddon, we could call it.
Yeah, that's probably a better word.
And I think in just to finish off quickly, in productive ecosystems, we always see the rate of growth matching the rate of decay. And as you alluded earlier, we're in this cycle of depletion. We're taking, and then we think that we can feed the soil with these synthesized inorganic fertilizers that supply not even a fraction of what the plant needs, and destroying soil structure at a time. So we're in this cycle of disease that needs a radical rethink.
Yeah, I think just taking that into sort of another perspective is human beings, from my point of view, are constantly trying to press pause on ecosystems and kind of halt it, stop it from doing what it naturally wants to do. Nature in itself is very dynamic and is constantly evolving and adapting and changing, trying to strive towards finding an equilibrium and a balance. And we are quite good at knowing what we want and not looking outside of that very narrow-minded channel and just trying to say, just stop. I want that particular ecosystem. And I think if we can start to change our mindsets towards looking at maybe a more dynamic system and incorporating ourselves back into the ecosystem, because we're part of the ecosystem, we've kind of removed ourselves from. Yeah. If we can get back into it, then hopefully, we'll become part of it and kind of reap the health benefits from it as well. Mm-hmm.
So how do we get this transformation? How do we get the message out into the world? Because this is kind of crazy. I'm 45 years old. I'm super interested in health and planetary health. And I didn't know even, I don't call myself ignorant, but in this area for sure, I would say I'm completely ignorant in this area. And that can't be. We need to spread the message about the importance of the soil. How do we do it?
Well, I think this is where you come in.
Yeah.
I think the system is failing itself. The food system, as in the people is there to serve, is failing itself. We're seeing, as we mentioned earlier, a decline in nutritional density of food. And as I see it, we need to develop new markets. And this is about value systems, as I see it. I don't see anything more important than our own health, individually and collectively. That's Octavia's greatest asset is our health. And when we define it as something binary, as in I'm just healthy, we might be carrying symptoms, but actually we could be getting ill. And I think that we need to actually be consistently building health into our bodies through feeding ourselves a rich diet. And that in itself is a value system. It's about appreciating that what you're doing is, perhaps a radical gesture of self-love, you could say, of really appreciating that, you respect yourself and you respect what you're putting in your body. And to that end, we could see this as an education issue. I had as I mentioned earlier, luxury of being fed a really rich diet. That was my baseline. A lot of inner cities, especially in the United Kingdom, they don't have that. They're brought up on cheap food, and the reality is that food shouldn't be this cheap. We're just dependent on oil, a very, very inefficient conversion of oil into food, and food's become this monstrous industry that is really damaging ecosystems. That's what the whole Brazil thing is over.
Yeah, but if you look at the human health and the gut microbiome, the tarmflora, as we say in Swedish, the research area in this field is just about 10 years old, where it's really been exploding, where you understand how this is almost like a second brain into the body and completely controlling our immune system. And how about the soil health? Because I see this, I assume the researchers or people who work with this are either working with soil or they're working with human health. But if we could combine them, because to me, they are just sort of mirroring each other. They have basically exactly the same function, but one is inside the body and one's inside the soil.
Yeah, they're two parts of the same system, and two parts of the same thing, rather. And that's the kind of modern scientific approach, is really to kind of look at reductionist ways of thinking, and clearly nature doesn't work in that way. And I see that there is a huge emphasis needed on educating both farmer and consumer as to how we can, I think, one, understand ecological processes to a greater and deeper degree, and two, how we can develop markets that really start appreciating and valuing the products that are being delivered. And the free market simply doesn't do that. Everyone's product is shipped onto the free market, and we buy it because we don't have any other alternatives.
Mm-hmm. I think collaboration as well is like a really crucial part of this, is like knowing what your area of your skills are and being able to work within your own community and collaborate with the people around you, and, finding out, what my strengths and weaknesses are as a person, and going to, your community, your family around you, and really working together and bringing ideas and sharing. And because there's a lot of knowledge out there, there's a lot of work that's been done. It's bringing the scientists, the farmers, the consumers, all of them together, to sort of try and work on the problem and find a solution for it.
Yeah, I would see like a good quartet of people, one being a communicator, one being a doctor, one being a farmer, and one being some kind of scientist, or maybe you don't even need the scientist, but connecting the doctor with the farmer would be super powerful. Mm-hmm. I know that's being done in some cases in the States, and I think that could be But
our culture here in the West is essentially to, if you study to become a doctor, you're given a book of notes 2 inches thick on pathology. And my question is, how can you build health by studying disease?
I did a podcast yesterday with a doctor called Peter Martin, and it's commonly known. I mean, in Sweden, you have 12 and a half hours of nutrition in your medical training. So that's not a lot, to say the least. And obviously we need to do, since food has such a huge impact on our human health, we also need to understand the next level. I think that when I was trying to understand, you have the food chain, which is like the näringskedja in Swedish, where the small, like if we would have the plankton is eaten by the fish, which is eaten by the human or whatever. So it's a nutritional development, one linear development. And then you have the food web where everything is sort of intricate and working together. And if we would understand better how this all is connected, I think that would be hugely important. I sort of lost my train of thought. I don't know what I was saying, but
Well,
fuck it.
a food, like taking a food chain, is a very sort of humanized concept, really, because that's what we need in order to process information, is looking at, the flow of energy and nutrients from one organism up the food chain. But the food web and well, even a food web is a simplified version of what is happening. But I think it's one of our issues as a species, is we like to sort of simplify things and take things down into really tiny sort of chunks or subjects. And when we start to combine all of those subjects together and work out how that one slots into the next and how they all link up, then we start to get a better idea of how the whole thing works and sort of functions healthily.
Well, yeah, that's probably, I think, one of the critical issues here, that we try to make things so simple. We oversimplify, and that can be good to create an understanding, but what you then understand is not representing the truth. So it's dangerous.
I think as well, you tend to lack the feeling side of things. So it's all very sort of data-based and sort of analytical, but you tend to lose what you're, the heart and soul of what you're feeling for that subject. Growing food is an art. It's not necessarily just a science. So it's combining, the subjects together as well, creating art.
And something I'm very interested in is something called the true cost of food. And that is simply not taken into account, to my knowledge, in the way that we need. And the amount of sugar that is processed and ingested by us has huge health implications later down the line that burdens healthcare services, etc. And I think that is something that needs to be looked at on a policy level. I don't understand why soil health is not on the agenda of policy for every single government on the planet. There's simply nothing more important in terms of feeding humans a nutrient-rich diet. That's a responsibility.
Yeah, I know exactly really what you're talking about. I did a rip-off, and I did an ad in Dagens Nyheter 2 years ago, I think, where I did a rip-off of another grocery chain called Willys in Sweden, where they have this Sweden's cheapest grocery bag. And I did it with Paradiset. And I said, we have the Sweden's cheapest groceries, because if you take the total cost into account with the costs of the process from taking it from nature all the way. But after it was published, I think it took 5 minutes before the head legal counsel of Axfood called me and told me to take that out of the system. So, and they threatened me with some pretty nasty legal stuff. So I didn't have much of a choice. But like you say, if we would understand, and if we could measure, which we can, but if we would also put it on the price tag, the cost of what the destruction, the conventional farming is causing. Somebody needs to pay for it. And right now it's nature.
Yeah, the ecology picks up the costs, and that's unacceptable. We need to have accountability within this economic model, and we simply don't. And I think, there are many, Octavia and I were talking about this in the car this morning, and I was saying that, the currency of exchange, as in the money, that's become the end itself for the farmer, and the food is just a sort of byproduct to get there. So they could be doing anything, and I think that's a bit tragic, and the loss of community and the implications. I mean, that's for another subject completely.
But I think what you said, Octavia, food is art, and I would even make that a bit stronger. I would say, like, the soil so being the manager or caretaker of soil health, that will probably, I mean, that should be the coolest job you can have, basically, because you are the steward of the planetary future.
Yeah, well, I guess it's more than just a career, isn't it? It's more than just a role. It becomes, your life as a species, as sort of a living organism on the planet. We need food to survive. We need water, and we need sort of a way of protecting ourselves from the elements. And so they're really, I mean, apart from maybe happiness as well, the things that are really crucial to our well-being and our health. And I think not enough emphasis is placed on the real sort of fundamental elements that we require, and instead importance is placed on things that don't matter in our lives. And we find ourselves very stressed and very worked up about inconsequential things. And really the biggest thing, I mean, in the UK they say that we've only got sort of 100 years left of really functioning topsoil left. So at some point we are going to be seeing the costs of our actions, and so it's kind of time to get back.
And this is something that I think would be quite easy to explain to anybody, because if you have you have a finite, a limited amount of nutrition, let's say that, in the ground, and if you just keep taking, everybody understands it's gonna run out.
Yeah.
So and the question is it in 50 years, is it in 100 years, but it's gonna run out, and then we're in some serious problems. So in order to mitigate that, we need to start acting differently now.
Yeah. So in an ecosystem that's sort of maybe untouched by humans, or say before we sort of started intensive agriculture, soil was a resource that was continually renewed, and it was sort of in this perpetual cycle of being topped up with nutrients and sort of a continuous flow of energy and minerals and things. But because we like to sort of farm specific areas, and we're taking out more than we're sort of putting back. So,
but to bring some hope into this discussion, one thing that I found is the good thing is the tempo, that you can actually, it doesn't take 50 years to bring it back. This is one of the fastest ways of changing what we're doing into something good, because the plants and the roots and everything, we're talking a few years maybe, and then you have something that previously was almost a desert can be a very, a flourishing area.
Yeah, getting carbon into the soil is, doesn't take that long. It's, maybe 2 or 3 years of sort of sustainable practices can increase your soil carbon by percent, which in the sort of the scheme of sort of climate change and those sort of scary topics is incredibly useful and a valuable tool. So,
but why the F is this not being talked about more? I don't understand it. It gets me super frustrated, because this is something that we all could start talking about, and we can actually change, because here the consumer power is pretty strong, because it's everything that food is something that we have a connection to, all of us. We eat at least 3 times a day. And if we start to understand that it's also a finite resource and we're going to kill ourselves, we're going to kill the planet, there's, I think, the solution to the problem, that we need to start demanding that the food is coming from regenerative agriculture.
Sure. I think the work that Octavia and I are talking about, or we are talking about, is highly inconvenient to the system. There's this order to the system that is manipulated and contorted to ensure that these companies, these big corporate companies, are very well established and stay well established. And if we start implementing a new way of this carbon farming or regenerative farming, then there's this huge disruption. And
what would
education,
I completely agree with you, because they have a lot of money and they want the status quo, because then they continue to earn money. But what would be the most common, answer that you get if you say, okay, let's turn this farm into regenerative farming instead of the conventional?
I think
they would say that the yields are going to be lower and it's not going to work. And
sure, I think it's very important to appreciate that the reason that nitrogen fertilizers, for example, were used is because we needed them. We tilled soil, we tilled the fertility or plowed the fertility of soil out of it. And so we needed this input. And now we appreciate that actually there are drastic consequences to that on a biodiversity level, on a climate level, on a food level. And these shifts, as you're saying, aren't happening fast enough. We really need to do something about it. A good friend of mine, when I told him that I was starting 59 Degrees a number of years ago, he said most people start a business. Most people sell it. What did he say? He said something along the lines of most people send a message to sell a product, and I'm selling a product and a service to send a message. This topic for me is like it's a life's work, and we won't see the shifts. I don't believe we will see the shifts that we need to in our lifetime. But I think that's more of a reason to act. I want my children to see me investing my time in something that I feel wholeheartedly worthwhile, and I think, unfortunately, the majority of us don't. The majority of us don't have that opportunity or don't make that opportunity.
But is it because we're living in urban communities too far away from the farming
And I think that's the transition that we need to make in terms of bringing farming to the city, in terms of rooftop farming. And that's something that I'm very interested in, is taking the byproducts from industries like yourself and converting them into a viable medium to grow food with. And so we don't need to haul in food, not necessarily with rooftops and rooftop gardening, etc., and green spaces. That's potentially one of the answers. And I'm not looking for gimmicks. I'm looking for real world solutions that can solve this crisis, and we need to find this closed loop and build this closed loop system to ensure that all organic byproducts from cities go back into soil. These cities are very, very expensive on an energy level. They're a very expensive way of life, and on a biological level, we'd call that parasitic. We're taking more than we're feeding back. And that's not to shame, it's just to allude to the topic, to say that, culture isn't any set entity. Culture is something that we can reshape and reform. And I think inherently, when you change a system for the better, or rather, when you make something better, it changes, right? That's the emphasis. So for me, it's not about fighting the system and sort of all the sort of activism and placards and all of that. It's simply to make it better, and then the system will change itself. And that inherently, I would say, is what the work that Octavia and I are involved with, heavily involved in the kind of speaking about this and talking about how important we both see it is.
Yeah, taking responsibility, I think, for your actions. If we were sort of, if an individual is farming the land, or farming, if they're doing it in a responsible way, in a sustainable way, for sort of future generations to come, that's service is going to be self-perpetuating and is going to go into the future. If we're sort of just taking from the system and not doing it in a responsible way, then the system can't carry on. So I think it's just about having a respect for where how you're living and all the things that you need in order to live. Just taking responsibility for those products.
How can we make it so? I'm thinking on a bigger scale now. As politicians, we should. Politicians should be seeing this and then maybe subsidize regenerative farming and penalize the conventional farming, basically. I'm not happy to say that about farmers, because I think, or just incentivize is better, not penalizing, but incentivizing the change where it's actually affordable and profitable to switch to
Sure.
regenerative farming.
I think it's a pretty tragic situation that farmers have to compete with the same economic restraints as people producing golf balls, for instance. You know, one actually builds health into the community, the other is a pastime, but yet they have the same economic restraints. And perhaps even more so, more competition and kind of sponsorship of all of that is very difficult. And so our understanding of what we're feeding off is limited. And I think the food standards industry have a responsibility in terms of providing the exact inputs that were used in order to grow these materials. So if you're using glyphosate, that needs to be on the label. We all know now clearly that glyphosate is a cancer-causing agent and is dangerous to human health, yet we can use it on food that we're eating, and that just seems absolutely ridiculous. So I like to use metaphors, and I would say that if you go into a Ferrari shop and you buy a Ferrari and it's got, you know, like this 2 horsepower engine that doesn't do what you think it should, then, you know, obviously you can take it back. But with food standards the way they are, and that is what's happening, we're seeing 25-30% drops in food nutrition. So the engine of, you know, what's required in order to fuel our body simply isn't there. But because we have no way of measuring that, well, we do have ways of measuring it. It's just they're not kind of put out for the consumer to see. And I think that's a responsibility that governments have and food suppliers have to the consumer.
On a positive note, back in the UK, there are talks to so farmers are given a subsidy because of the amount of land that they have, and hopefully that will, depending on Brexit, of course, and all of that palaver, but should be changing towards the way that they manage the land. So they will be paid certain amounts depending on the functionality of that land in order to prevent flooding and produce healthy food, looking at sort of soil health as one of the primary indicators. And as Joe said just a minute ago, we don't have a way yet, or a tailored way of measuring soil health exactly, because it's so complex. But but steps are being made in order to sort of to look at it. So I think there is positivity there, and it's definitely sort of it's developing.
Perfect. And those 2 examples are something I would love to follow up on. So please connect me with this. I want to know about the subsidies going on in England, and also to be able to put on the label either the sort of the pesticides being used in the production on the cheap products, or like the nutrition density would also be something that could be interesting, however you would then do it. I don't know, but
when you get these little tools, I've read about these small tools coming out in the United States, and they look a little bit like a torch or a flash lamp, you'd say in America. And it's basically a mass spectrometer, so it takes a reading of the nutrients held within that, and then the question isn't, is this organic or is it conventional or biodynamic or whatever? It's, does this piece of fruit or veg have what my body needs in order to do what I'm buying it for? And the answer is either yes or no. And you would know that if the answer is yes, then the net impact of that growing production would be of beneficial, because that is the best way to get nutrients into your into your plants is through the means of regenerative agriculture, without a doubt.
Cool. Guys, I think we could sit and talk for hours. If you want to know more about this, what should I do as a listener? Where should I go to for more information?
Well, Octavia puts out regular videos on YouTube. She's to be found on 59 Degrees Soil, and we have our 59 Degrees Academy website, which is updated regularly with
what's the
blogs.
web address?
59degrees.se, and we have regular blogs Tavy were writing regular blogs on the health of planet health, human health.
Do you also have an
health.
Instagram account?
We have 59 Degrees is the name of the Instagram.
I'm asking, I know, but I want you to say it. Perfect. Guys, this is so interesting. And I think my next, I'm going to try to invite this, one of my favorite farmers, Adam Arnesson, who has this fantastic farm, and see if I can get him here. He's been a bit reluctant, but I hope by calling him out like this, I hope he can join. And then hopefully we can sit together at a later time, because this is so interesting. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you.